It's a golden rule not to talk in your own town, but I broke the rule. One of the nice things about talking in your own town is you don't have to sort of say those platitudes about what a wonderful city I'm sitting in to talk to you guys. Can everybody hear me okay? There's no problems with the sound? Okay, for someone like myself whose emphasis is on practice, one of the benefits of preparing a lecture such as this is that one has to analyze and verbalize the often subconscious or intuitive motivations for design decisions. This is very different from the daily practice of presenting pragmatic arguments to clients in order to explain a building's concept. So this evening I'll try to take off the everyday hat of practice in an attempt to explain rather than to justify our work. My early exposures to any form of architectural expression were very much in the functional, rational tradition, with little time for either the trivial or the ornamental. I drew this sketch from memory because the structure was demolished when I was about 5 years old. But I spent a fair amount of time inside it, and as is the case when fondly recalling childhood places, my memory is good. The components are precast concrete panels, about the height of a small adult, and in pieces that could be manually handled and erected by two people with minimal tools. The function was an air raid shelter, erected in our case in the dining room, where the shell-like form was intended to protect the people inside when a bombed house collapsed on top of it. That was my first conscious awareness of a real purpose building as experienced by myself and my two cousins here in this photograph. After high school, I studied architecture at Kingston School of Art, which in those days was a 5-year program with 1 year of practical experience between third and fourth year, totaling 6 years of architectural education. And for that practical year, I decided to look for experience abroad and chose to go to Germany. Of course, it was a very different time then. This was only 14 years after the war, and England was still very much an isolated island, and travel was not the ubiquitous pursuit that it is today, and English was not the international language that it has become since. Because my own ideas were still very much a work in process, I decided to look for a small office that would involve me directly with the responsibilities of making architecture. Büro Becher in Stuttgart was an office of 5 people. Max Becher himself was more focused on an academic career, and because everyone else in the office was fully occupied, he offered me the responsibility for the design, working drawings, and construction phases for a very small pavilion as a part of a national exhibition located in a park in Stuttgart. Apart from the principal, nobody in the office spoke any English, and I at that time spoke no German. So by default, drawing became the lingua franca between us, and this resulted in my developing thorough and explicit drawings, which became even more critical when I had to communicate with the contractors during construction, mostly with exploded axonometric drawings of building details. Fortunately for me, the tradesmen in Germany had a much higher level of skill and respect than their counterparts in England. So what had started out as a skeptical relationship between an inexperienced student and highly trained tradespeople progressed into a very supportive mentorship. Based on my experience in Stuttgart, I decided after graduation that I would still best benefit from a small office that would share my professional ideals, but would also entrust me with a significant level of responsibility and of autonomy. I had met Roman Holter, I think, at a lecture at the AA, and I joined his firm when they received the commission for a school for special needs children. Roman's interests were more philosophical, and he entrusted me with the design and again the construction, but this time in English. Much as I enjoyed working with Roman, and we finished this building together, I wanted to see more before settling down in London, and so I decided to go to Canada. Before leaving, I took a motorcycle trip and photographed some of what I knew would be in contrast to where I imagined I was going, such as the permanence of this stone barn in Lancashire, or this man in a churchyard well, I still think of it as a small country with a large population. I lived with, this is my neighbor, and we sort of all lived around the graveyard and used it as a common garden, if you like. And the vestiges of a once powerful but declining industrial nation. And a country where over centuries no part had not been either agriculturally or industrially transformed. And I came to Canada. And I arrived in an energetic city that was only 80 years old at that time, a more vital, if less pretty city than it is today. This long-gone sawmill was in False Creek, when False Creek was wholly industrial. And of course the mountains. This is a much more recent photograph because there were no container terminals in those days. And I explored the Gulf Islands and the improvisational initiative of people constructing their own houses without the constraints of tradition or of bylaw, such as this dwelling on the Hornby Island. And then it was time to work, to get a job. And I started working at Ronan Iredale, which was a unique practice in that rather than being structured hierarchically, it was set up like an incubator, encouraging teams within the office to take full design responsibility within the constraints of a highly organized support system. That was the organizational creativity that the principals, Bill Rowan and Rand Iredale especially, really enjoyed. The first significant project to which I was entrusted was an office building for the Crown Life Insurance Company at 1500 West Georgia. The form was caused by various criteria, one of being that the angled intersection of Pender at Georgia Street, to which we responded to the minor street, thereby strengthening the potential sense of place and focusing on the view of both the city and the downtown. This was further enhanced by a proposed footbridge connecting the West End across Georgia to the central business district. Unfortunately, this was not built, and only the abutment to the bridge was built, which has retail units underneath it, and the resulting form is kind of a bit of a rather glib vestige, I think, anyway. To address our environmental concerns, we ensured that the window glass area did not exceed that of any standard square, 10,000 square foot floor plate, which was the norm at that time. And we did this by bringing the concrete core to the south edge of the perimeter, the place of highest potential heat gain and lowest view impact. We worked with Don Strang, a mechanical engineer at DWT, in combination with the structural engineer Bo Babicki, to further improve energy costs by extracting the warm air between the glass and the blinds. That's the purpose of those round holes that I'm so often asked about in the edge of the beams. just a small anecdote. Just the other day, I was on a construction site, and a carpenter foreman came up to me and said, I'd really like to meet you. You designed Georgia Banks. And I said, I think you've got the wrong person. And he said, no, it's that brick, angled brick bank against the waterfall in 1500 West Georgia. And I said, oh yeah. And he said, he was a skateboarder. And he said, this place is famous. He said it's on movies all over the world. Georgia Banks is one of these places to go. And so I said, well, thank you very much. And I said, what do you think about the tower? And he said, what tower? So after a few years as a partner at RIA, I decided that the best way to further develop my architectural ideas would be to set up my own practice. And as is pretty much the norm, the first project was a small house, in this case in Lions Bay. Two factors initiated the design. The first was the precarious geological nature of the area. It was economically unfeasible to go deep enough to bedrock, and so our geotechnical engineer advised us to minimize retaining walls, which could be subject to pressure from the frequent flooding, and instead to utilize point footings, which would allow the flood water to flow unimpeded through the site. The second factor was that through his father, our client had access to a stack of steel pipes. The pipes run through the roof level and support a wood frame structure with the exterior walls prefabricated and bolted to the pipes. The small house is countered by a large-scale gesture, such as large-scale gestures such as the window at the entry and the bridge which continues to the other face of the house. And which doesn't show here, but actually showed, I think, in the drawing, the big window wall on the other side was all made by the contractor out of wood. Over the years, I'd spent a considerable amount of time in the Cariboo and had been introduced to two young brothers who owned a sawmill in Williams Lake. And they'd asked me to work with them. Their current office was 2 trailers, to work with them to replace those trailers and build an office. The program called for an area of around 4,000 square feet, the size of a, these days, modest house, that could easily be dwarfed in the context of the large industrial structures of the mill. To maintain the administrative presence, the small area is single-loaded over the, as you can see, in the length of the plan, and the building is only 14 foot 6 inches wide. And also because the mill is located at the bottom of a valley traversed by the highway, the roof became a significant elevation. This building transgressed between my time as a partner at RIA and the establishing of my own practice. And although the design allowed for significant administrative expansion, it was not enough for the newly emerging use of IT in the forestry sector. And a few years later, we were asked to design an addition that would add 60% to the size of the first building. I found it extremely difficult to design an addition to a form that I had thought was finite. The existing building ended at the roadway, so could not be extruded further, and numerous options always competed with rather than complemented the existing building. The requirements of the IT offices suggested autonomy. And so on the basis that the smallest perimeter for the largest area is contained within a circle, the new building is 2 stories high with the increased mechanical functions housed below an exterior patio. So all of this that you see in the drawing is actually 60% of this circle. The piece next to it is actually 60% increase in the area of the building. Where initially we were trying to give a small building a larger scale than its area warranted, we were now attempting to do the exact opposite. As in the first building, we wanted to demonstrate wood as a progressive structural material, and we supported the strength of the original building with one continuous truss supported at either end, which you can just see a bit of in the back of that model. In the addition, we wanted the IT people who had little contact with the mill, unlike the workers in there, to be aware of their purpose by exposing them to the constant replenishing log storage beyond the two-story window. The long overhang avoided the south-facing bright Caribou sun and mitigated any computer glare. To avoid the banal tyranny of the circle, the inserted window structure is off-center and allows for minimal obstruction at the lower floor for group meetings and public consultation, as you can probably see on the underside of this model and the shadow that it causes. Many of our projects are outside the Lower Mainland, and we find the communication between drawing and site will continue to be a challenge until fabrication is initiated by the same technology as utilized in the drawings. Those who saw the Achim Menges lecture last year will see how this direction is progressing, but still reducing rather than expanding the material and structural possibilities. One thought was to animate the working drawings so that the detail, supposed to be animated and it isn't, okay, so that the detail relationships were clear and could be isolated and expanded on as in this animation. This animates the whole working drawings which explode, and you can isolate it and you can isolate pieces of the drawings, but it's obviously not working. For a time as a child, I lived in Blackburn, Lancashire, and this row house was the home of a school friend. When we were asked to design a building to accommodate 9 dwelling units in False Creek, I remembered the humble dignity of this house, which I believed was due in large part to the simple and clear territorial definition of home. Although I advocated the row house ideal, which allowed for equal frontage on the street as well as the private ground level yards, there was one problem. The allocated width of site for the complete development was 110 feet, which equally divided between 9 houses would result in 12 feet wide houses. Fortunately, I was also one of the initiators of the project, so was in the position of an equal having to convince 8 respected skeptics rather than a subservient architect beholding to the dictates of a developer. It was to be the first home for a group of young families, all currently living in rented accommodation. And I asked them all to measure the smallest dimension of their largest room. And when we all met a week later, no one had a dimension that exceeded 12 feet. Therefore, that dimension, I argued, that the width should not be an issue, and we should concentrate on the arrangement of space to mitigate the potential tunnel of a long, narrow house. The gesture of a large skylight illuminating a generous stairwell in the center of the plan, combined with a 2-foot change in level on each of the 3 floors, created an expansive sense in total contrast to any feeling of confined compromise. In the belief that the smaller the dwelling, the more critical acoustic and visual privacy becomes, the walls are solid concrete. This was financially justified because the soil conditions necessitated 32 feet deep piling at a significant cost. And by utilizing the party walls as long span beams, we were able to eliminate 50% of the piles, which, combined with eliminating any finishes on the party walls, resulted in a final cost for that component that was the equivalent of traditionally framed acoustic construction, yet with far superior performance. When we were asked to look at, these are not necessarily in any sequence, by the way. They're more of a ideas flow than a chronological flow. When we were asked to look at the renovation potential of a 1960s split-level rancher in West Vancouver, I realized that this much maligned type represented the greatest housing boom in North American history, a boom that probably never will be exceeded. Yet the narrow definition of what is deemed heritage places little value on this. Just like the fate of the Blackburn row house that I showed you earlier, in its case replaced by a disastrous social experiment, refurbishment is ignored in favor of demolition. Much of the interior, and our client obviously agreed with us on that, and much of the interior partitioning was demolished to accommodate the changing living patterns compared to the early 60s, and a few formal adjustments were made, such as the insertion of daylight, which you see in this slide, into the normally awkward bulkhead at the split, in the split level plan. The changes do not romanticize the era, but instead illustrates the potential to find its value before resorting to less sustainable demolition and rebuilding in the pursuit always of the new. This is a project that is just completing for the Calgary Folk Music Festival. And I show the first slide because we find that increasingly we have to unearth the potential that is often unrecognized in the banality of the original brief. And then we have to convince the client of that unearthed potential. And then we have to help the client raise the money to realize that potential that we have unearthed. And all of this before the fee for architectural services has started to kick in. This is a fundraising document that David and our office devised and authored for a new building for the administrative offices for the Calgary Folk Music Festival, a highly profitable organization that had purchased a small infill lot in the community of Inglewood, an area in Calgary that is emerging with similar characteristics to Main Street in Vancouver. The brief for the building was to accommodate the growing full-time administrative staff. And another component was to provide a space that could accommodate the large influx of mostly volunteer staff during the time of the actual open-air summer festival, with the thinking that this space could, in the rest of the year, provide some sort of rehearsal space for aspiring performers. However, given the location and our own familiarity with small performance spaces in other parts of the world, including the community dance halls in Texas that I had recently visited on a trip down there, we believed that if the whole design acknowledged its potential, it could become a nucleus in the cultural and social life of the Inglewood community. To avoid the formal qualities of most performance spaces, we thought the materials should reflect the commonplace rather than the refined, and we explored structural options using reclaimed timber. Because the building is just finishing and not yet photographed, I'll limit my comments to this structure. We devised a truss system that could be prefabricated in components and then assembled on site. So this was the first model that we did of the three-dimensional truss that we figured could be broken into components and transported. We involved the structural development and the fabrication with Structurecraft, who you maybe all are familiar with. They're based in Richmond. It's an offshoot of Fast and Ep, and they built the Richmond Oval structure. And one of our mandates, as we worked on the design that we gave to Structurecraft, was that, as in traditional structural carpentry, the connecting spine should be wood rather than steel. One of the things that always bothers me when you see a lot of these heavy timber structures is that there's so much steel in them that really the wood almost becomes incidental. So we worked together with Structurecraft on this, and here are the various spline conditions. There's one connection. Remember, this is reclaimed timber, so there's knots and things like in it. So it was from an old mill. And there's a completed truss for shipping. And there it is, being hoisted into place. To me, there's always a somewhat, how would I say, illicit thrill in being in the close proximity of a structure that is designed and scaled to be seen from afar. You sense that sometimes especially if you get into the dome of a cathedral or something like that. And this will be the view from the service catwalk overlooking the performance space. This is actually shows on the left is what is now the performance space, and on the right is the administrative offices. And we intentionally separated it because we were concerned that the people in the administration would, if they were sort of looking into that space all the time, then the people who wanted to rent it for their own uses would feel that they were always being watched. So we used that simple separation, which actually allows for a little coffee place and a lot of light to come into the administrative part. And that's the trusses as completed on site. This is a building in Kamloops. Actually, it was a building in Kamloops. Unfortunately, it's been demolished, the Purity Feed building. Kamloops is one of those interior towns that I think had a lot of sort of, I use the word robustness, I guess, as opposed to the more refined character of Vancouver. I think a lot of that is being lost in those towns as things like the Coquihalla increase access, unfortunately being lost, and I'm not sure that people are aware of it, but maybe it's inevitable. But that's the sort of building that you saw there right in the city. This bridge is still there, the Red Bridge, which is very close to downtown. And we were there, we worked on this building together with Nigel Baldwin Architects, and we were there to design a building that included the art gallery, the library, and the government offices. One of our feelings there was that we should put the least, I wouldn't say the least desirable, but the least visited facilities closest to the entrance. And so we put the art gallery close to the entrance. We put next to that the library, and then up above and distant from everything was the government offices, which people had to go to anyway. So that was, I should say that this group of three was a marriage of convenience rather than opportunity. And but we felt it was somehow there was a relationship that we should exploit, and the whole building faces onto a shared space which is intentionally ill-defined, although very controlled, so that it's kind of like, how could I describe it? an eddy in a river, if you like, where you sort of brush against rocks all the time. So always when somebody is going from the gallery to the library or to the offices, there's always in contact with each other. And I think that's worked actually quite successfully. This is an old cottage in Suffolk in England that I used to know the people owned. And it reminded me, I was reminded of it when we were asked to design a small place on Salt Spring Island. The family, they had 70 acres on Salt Spring on the waterfront, but they're from the north of England, who are very pragmatic people, and they wanted to build it themselves, and they said that 1,200 square feet was enough for them and their 2 kids. And so because they were building it themselves and yet they weren't builders, we thought, okay, we'd make it a very simple plan, 30 feet by 30 feet. It was built up against a bank, and so entered at the upper level of the house. And there's a sort of a diagram. Obviously within that 30 feet by 30 feet, it would be difficult to get spatial variation to reflect the various uses in the house. And what we did was simply rotate the ridge so that in some parts the roof was longer, as you can see. I don't know if this is very clear, this diagram. And you can see there that's the roof looking up at the roof. And then this is the higher part. You enter at the top right-hand side there, and then you come in and you come down the stairs, and that splits the living area, which is the more sort of entertaining area, on the bottom of the stair to the right, and then on the left of the stair is the more intimate dining area. And they raised their kids there. It was big enough. We were asked to design a school for an Indian band in the Chilcotin region. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the area. For me, it's one of the most spectacular areas of the province. It's very different from the coastal regions. It has a very harsh winter, has a very hot summer. The lives of the bands are very different than the coastal bands. There's very little decoration. It's a harsh life. In the winters, the bands build these kugli houses in which you enter this hole through in the top of the structure of the roof, and you go down into it. And the smoke comes out of it, and and a couple of families would live in there, maybe 2 or 3 families. We thought this was a good sort of metaphor, if you like, for education, where the elders are down there and they're educating the children in the harsh winters. And so our school, initially we tried to bury it into the ground, but obviously there are all sorts of exiting problems. So rather than that, we took the ground up over the school. This is just looking. This is a bird's eye axle looking up at the kugli center of the school, which is where the kids still gather, and it's the more social center of the school, if you like, and also for the community. They use it as well. And it's constructed of logs that were brought in by the band and peeled and erected by them. But as I say, there's very little any sort of decorative tradition in that area. We rarely do interiors, but I was intrigued when a young doctor asked me to look at what I'd call an orphan space. It was a little triangular space downtown for a medical clinic that he wanted to build. And so we went and looked at a number of medical clinics, and we found one of the sort of, I guess the first thing we'd get together, and one of the things that I said, you know, we've got to agree on one thing. There'd be no signage or no pictures or anything on the walls. In contrast to the clinics that we'd seen that had polluted lungs on the walls and anything to sort of to frighten the patients rather than to sort of make them calm. And he was very good. He agreed with that. And in fact, there's no signage at all. This is just before they open for the day. And except for one, you have to have a washroom sign. It's by bylaw. And so even that, we routed out the male and female symbols, and it's painted the same color as the wood. So it's just like this gently embossed symbol into the wall. I always think it's good to have one house on the go. I like working for house clients because you're not working for a committee, you're not working for some junior vice president. Although the house clients tend to be tough, at least you can, they haven't come to you because you're the cheapest, they come to you because they think you're the best. And you can have, and often do, rigorous arguments with the clients. This is a house on the waterfront in West Vancouver. Interesting couple in that they have very little, how can I put it? They're totally the opposite of any sort of bombast. They like to entertain in a great way, but they do not like to show their wealth outwardly. It's kind of like the Scots, I guess, the Scottish, and in some ways I found the Catalans have a similar sort of characteristic. It's only when you go into their homes that they sort of show you what they really have. And very simple materials, concrete block. It's a ground face concrete block, but with contrasting with the garage doors, which are brass rather than wood. And then once you come in, you walk down into the main living area. The whole structure is supported, or the whole roof structure, I should say, is supported on this steel beam. The roof is is draped over it. And all of these walls, by the way, they have a big art collection, but this was before the art was hung. So, and then inside you look out over this main space, which is almost like a gallery space, is 20 feet high, 21 feet high. In total contrast, this is a live-work studio on Odlum Drive, just one block east of Clark Drive. The model, maybe the model's a bit deceptive. We cut the back of the model short. In fact, the opening is equidistant between the 4 units, 2 at the back and 2 at the front. And then there's another smaller unit below. A unique thing about this site was that it had no lane, which is quite rare in Vancouver. So we had to somehow get parking in there and get access to the parking. So one of the things that I did notice when I was researching live-work studios was that they were always very bright at one end and very dark at the other, because they were generally accessed through a central corridor. So one of the issues to get into the parking, which we had to provide at the back and underneath, was to create this courtyard between the two two double blocks, with an obvious precedent here. And in so doing, we got light in both sides and also cross ventilation from the courtyard to the outside. And this is where you move from the courtyard to, and there's a, if you like, a subtle definition from what is the common to what is the private. The common is the concrete, the solid, and then once you go to towards the private, then you walk onto the steel, which is only yours. This is just looking from inside the model across the courtyard to the back of the unit behind, and I don't know if it's very clear, but we actually cut up into sort of small pieces the window, the big window in there, the object being that in any area where you could look straight across, the glass would be opaque, but if you could get an oblique view, then we would leave clear glass. But that could only really be determined once you were in the building. And that's the building when it was built, and you can see where some of it is opaque and some of it is clear. And every unit had a full deck, and one of the criteria that I'd suggested and the client had agreed on was that it should be possible to put at least 3 feet of soil anywhere on that floor. And in reality, I think we had to go 2 inches further on the depth of the trusses. And we put the stairs to the decks are on the outside of the building, and that's of course intentional, because if it was on the inside, it's part of your FSR. If it's on the outside, it's not included. So you gain a lot of space. And the other thing, of course, is that because it's just one big space, other than the back wall, there's no rigidity, no structural stiffness. So we had to provide this seismic bracing on those large areas. This is a house on Saturna Island. It's actually a house and a studio for a designer. And it was like a lot of those desirable places on the remote parts of the island. There's actually a lot of people find the desirable place and all want to live in the same area because of the views usually. So this lot had a house on either side of it, which of course had the potential to looking directly into the new house. So for that was the reason we separated the studio and the house and used them as buffers to create this terrace between the two buildings, as you can see on this drawing, which shows the house on the right. And then that looks beyond into looking across to the Olympic. Well, you don't see the Olympic range there, but that's the United States over there. And we wanted to, you see the one column there is actually on the outside of the window, is in a sense to sort of visually take everything beyond the glass line. There's huge winds here, and one interesting fact is 118 kilometer per hour winds are quite normal. We have this big overhang which kind of acts like a wing, and you can be standing outside with the rain and the wind coming in there, and it it somehow deflects just as a wing would. It deflects above the roof, and you could sit outside there and be totally undisturbed. I always tell the client that was intentional when we designed it. But in 1984, we were hired by CN Rail to do a pavilion for Expo 86. And one of the reasons that they decided so late to hire anybody was that they weren't going to be at Expo 86. But then in 1984, CP Rail said that they were going to be there, and so CN had to be there as well. But that gave us little time to design well, not just for us to design a pavilion, but for the exhibition people, who in this case are more important than the architects, to design an exhibition. And I just happened at that time to be in Liverpool, and that's what this is. This is the main station in Liverpool. And while I was there, I thought, this is perfect. This canopy covers so many activities, from the obvious trains to buses to cabs to movie theaters to stores to restaurants. Everything is under that canopy. So I suggested to the client when I got back that this would be a nice thing to do here. Now, the common wisdom in exhibition design is to build a black box and then wrap it up in something that sort of attracts people from the outside. I argued that given the time, it was in the summer, given the location on the waterfront with views of the mountains, it was crazy to put everybody in a black box, and that this idea of just building this canopy and then allowing the exhibit designers to concurrently rather than sequentially work on their designs made sense. And we had a terrific guy from CN in Montreal who was really supportive. He liked the idea. He also liked the idea that CN would build the structure in their yards throughout the country, and then would take it by train to the site to be erected, and they would make a movie of this as a part of the exhibit. So we started working on a structural idea. We like to work with a lot of full-size details, as you can see here. And obviously some of the detailing was influenced by the sort of rolling stock that one sees. This is I always like this connection, putting the trusses together. And one of the things that was within the building is a theater. And as you see here, that's a drum. And above the theater on the roof was intended to be, because CN at that time had lots of hotels, to be a restaurant. Unfortunately, CN at that time was starting or thinking about divesting themselves of their hotels, so the restaurant was never built, which I think was a pity, because again, it would have had that same feeling that I like of being close to the structure. The canopy did not really need this column in the middle. There's 3 columns to supporting the canopy, but I felt that if we didn't have that, the theater was such a dominant form that it would overpower any of the exhibits. So it became actually it was the place for access up that column to the restaurant that wasn't built. There was a guy in my office at the time who I haven't seen him for years. I don't know if he's here possibly. A guy called Mark Vaughan, and we discussed how to. The problem was with these trusses, and we were working now with CY Low, was the stiffness where you join them. And Mark had been an avid and expert model plane maker, working models, flying planes, and he told me that the critical thing in a model plane is the stiffness of the wing. And so he was fantastic at how you use trusses, or not trusses, just struts to support the stiffness. And we just added 2 struts, and it stiffened the whole building. I mean, it's not enough to show you in here, but it was and see why I said it was a brilliant move. And there you see what I'm talking about, the view on the water and of the mountains, and the other thing that we did was, from my little experience of going to such exhibitions, more by reading about them, you spend most of your time lining up to get into something. So I thought that what we should do is actually, because they wanted the people to go into the theater at the higher level and then go down there just as you do into this space here, we'd make this bridge which would go right through the exhibit space. It was designed to hold one sitting in the theater, but while they were waiting, everybody would stand there. They would be able to see the exhibits. They were above all the action, and they themselves would become exhibits. And so that actually worked very well. This is the Belkin Gallery out at UBC. Like many buildings, its brief was much more ambitious than its budget. The budget was just over $3 million. And as a result of that budget, we had to work together with the client in identifying possible savings. Some of the things we did, like we found, I went out and realized that if you go, for instance, at the VAG, you'll get surges of crowds at lunchtime and various times of the day, whereas in places like institutions like this, it's more of just a constant trickle rather than these surges and then emptiness. And so I argued that we could actually get rid of the lobby, and the lobby could become, when there was an opening or something, the congestion would be actually beneficial. And so the only thing that defines the lobby is this canopy, which is actually a circulation space above on the level above, which is the administrative level. And then there was a plan to put a basement with storage and archives and things like that. And of course, all that was deleted, and we put the storage on the main level behind garage doors with direct access to the gallery. So things like this corridor became almost a workplace when they were setting up shows. It became the lobby, and it became the circulation. And then even with areas like, by bylaw, you can only have a straight run for 12 feet. So if you have a 14-foot change in level, then usually at 7 foot you put a landing. So we dropped the landing as low as we could, so that's the 12-foot line coming down, and that becomes the lectern, that landing where during openings talks are given. And the brief also called for 3 quite small galleries, and I thought very restricted galleries, so proposed that we create big revolving walls that could configure in various ways according to the requirements of the particular exhibit. And you see here, one of the things that we did was intentionally they're not, the pivot point is not in the middle, because by setting it off, it gives you more variations, spatial variations. And because the pivot point is not in the middle, one side is lower than the other, so it's balanced in terms of weight, but it also allows the air circulation from one side of the gallery to the other. Actually, my first idea was that instead of having this column, which actually supports the structure and which is also the place of the pivot, my first idea was that we just have a short column, a short pivot if you like, and then there'd be a truss, and the column wouldn't go through to the base. The truss would sort of come down, and at each end of the wall there would be wheels, and the wall would therefore be a rotating column. So you'd have kind of a dynamic structure. But see why I wouldn't even talk to me about that. So. But a funny story. I always believe that anything ideas you have, architects should share. We just done this, and I got a phone call from. Oh well, I should go back a bit. When I say that you should share ideas, when we did that house in West Vancouver and we did the brass walls, we'd experimented with how to get a certain patina on the brass, and we were not happy with anything. So I said, let's phone Stephen Hall's office, because at that time he was doing a lot of brass, patinaed brass. So I phoned his office and asked the architect for, I forget which building it was, but I asked to talk to the architect. And the architect, I said, we'd like to know how you do that. And he said, oh no, we don't tell any things like that, So I said, okay, thanks. And this was a few years later, and we'd just done this, the gallery, and I got a phone call from Stephen Hall's office. And they said, what's the detail for those rotating walls? And I said, well, let me tell you a story. But I told him I sent him the details, and I said, the only one proviso I make is that you improve it. And this is, I guess it's the loading dock, which also, again, has double purpose. It's really the back porch. You call it a loading dock, and everybody in the Freddie Wood Theatre thinks it's awful. You call it a back porch, and they think it's wonderful. So it's all perception. It's just like those garage doors that I showed you of that house. I told the city, because we had a long problem with that they weren't garages. They were stables. And you could see them going warm and fuzzy. And anyway, so the loading dock, I wanted to sort of make it more than just a functional space, although it should be functional. And so this end is more the sort of end where people come in from the School of Architecture in that direction. And the other end is where trucks back up. So there it's a more solid concrete structure. And at this end it's a much more delicate structure. And I was actually sort of struggling with how to keep this fine structure stiff, laterally stiff. And it was actually a summer's day, and I was going to the office on the weekend, and I stopped on my bike, and I looked down, and of course that's exactly what a bicycle wheel does, and that's exactly what this is. That's really the spokes and the hub of a wheel. And we wanted to celebrate water rather than denying it in Vancouver, and this precast concrete, I think, was made 3 times before they got it right. And again, a gallery by its nature is an introverted box, so we wanted to sort of exaggerate the gestures at the entrance. This is probably not the best photograph that I took here because it's in deep shade, but but we wanted to sort of over detail that so it became a sort of an attraction through, or an attraction to the openings between this box. And where there was windows, we made a sort of, this is more like an exhibition window to look into rather than just simply a window to look out of. And just want to get something out here. Excuse me a minute. So I just wanted to finish on this saddle. To me, this saddle has all the qualities that architecture should aspire to. Made in Edmonton more than 70 years ago, I hadn't seen it for more than 30 years when it surfaced again, of all places, in the Salt Spring Island house. There is not a single trivial detail without an essential purpose. There is no superficial ornament to date it. It has improved both functionally and visually through both use and through time. And it will be as irrelevant in 50 years as it is today. Servicing and upkeep is virtually non-existent. It has retained its value, and incidentally, it is, in my mind, humbly exquisite. Kind of like the air raid shelter that I showed you at the beginning. Thank you.